Right, hello, let's talk about tariffs now. Probably a little over a week ago, 10 days ago, Donald Trump announced his trade tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China. And he introduced 25% tariffs on Canada apart from their oil, which was 10%. He imposed 25% tariffs on Mexico and 10% tariffs on all goods from China. Now the reason he gave for these tariffs was that basically two main reasons: migrants flowing across the border and fentanyl. Now fentanyl is a drug that it appears many Americans are taking and are addicted to, and he seems to blame China for that. Now from what I understand, most of the fentanyl flows across the border from Mexico, apparently more than 90%. So I'm not quite sure why he was targeting Canada with those. I mean, I think he's just targeting Canada because he kind of feels, I think he's even mentioned it should be another state of the USA. Because as far as I'm aware, not that much fentanyl flows across the border of Canada into America. And I also think that the migrant issue, a lot of those are coming from across the southern border with Mexico. So I'm not quite sure why he targeted Canada with the same tariff as he did Mexico. As regards to fentanyl in China, now China does make all the precursors, all the raw ingredients for fentanyl, and it sells them to sort of countries all around the world. But it only seems to be the USA who has this huge fentanyl problem. So I kind of don't understand how he can kind of blame China for that. It's almost like saying, well, China makes a lot of steel, and we import some of that into the US, and companies make guns with it, and there's a lot of gun crime in America. So let's tariff China because of their steel. It's kind of the same to me. I mean, if America have a fentanyl problem, then that's an American problem. If they weren't getting it through Mexico, they'd be getting it through somewhere else. Just because China makes the ingredients, I don't really see the tie up there. Anyway, a day after he'd announced these tariffs, he announced that he'd spoken to the Prime Minister of Mexico and that they'd come to some sort of deal where Mexico would help with the problem of the migrants on the border and try to stem the flow of fentanyl across the Mexican border into the USA. And Trump then announced that those tariffs had been delayed by 30 days. And then a couple of days later, or maybe a day later, he announced that he'd spoken to Justin Trudeau of Canada, Canadian Prime Minister. And again, he announced that they'd suspended the tariffs for another 30 days. But this wasn't the case with China. Now, rumour has it that he'd tried to contact Xi Jinping to get a conversation with him sort of fairly immediately after he'd announced the tariffs. But either China were in the New Year holiday and Xi Jinping wasn't available, or China refused the call. So he then went on to say that, I'm in no rush to speak to Xi Jinping. Anyway, subsequent to that, China have now announced their retaliatory tariffs, and these tariffs that China will impose will take effect on the 10th of February 2025. And there's a number of measures that China are taking. So first of all, there's a 15% tariff on US oil and coal. There's a 15% tariff on US coal and liquefied natural gas. and a 10% tariff on US crude oil, agricultural machinery and large engine vehicles. Now, personally, I don't think this will have a huge effect, because if you look at in 2024, so basically China imported 69 million barrels of oil, which is relatively small. It's less than 2% of China's total oil imports, and they imported 4.4 million metric tons, about 5.4% of LNG, and the total value of that trade was $8.4 billion. Now, also a portion of that LNG actually just goes through China and then goes on to Europe, and they just add a profit onto it. So as far as these tariffs on the oil and gas, all it will do is make Chinese companies just not buy oil and gas from the US. They will just buy it from somewhere else. You know, there's plenty other countries they can buy it from. They buy a lot of oil from Iran, and interestingly, Trump has just signed an executive order suggesting that America can have control over where Iran sells its oil. So it'd be interesting to see what China have to think about that. The tariffs of 10% on large engine cars, again, that won't make that much difference. In China, the people who can afford to buy them cars will buy them anyway, but the market's changing. A lot of foreign luxury cars now are struggling to sell, because there's a lot of higher end Chinese vehicles which are a much better value proposition. They're significantly cheaper. They have a lot more features and technology. So more and more wealthy Chinese people are going for them, like the Ito M9 from Huawei, the Stellato S9, another Huawei car. You know, you've got Zeekr, who have some high-end cars. So there's plenty of choice of Chinese vehicles now, so I don't think that's going to be a big thing. As regards in agricultural machinery, yes, China does still import agricultural machinery. That will probably affect John Deere more than anybody else, I guess, in the USA, because they're one of the big exporters to China. But China makes pretty much a majority of agriculture equipment itself. The Chinese can buy it from local producers who produce it significantly cheaper. And then they have, and now this is the one that I think will be the major one. So in the last round of sort of tariffs and export controls, China imposed export controls on sort of rare earth and metals. And I think that's really going to hurt the US. And this time around, they've put export bans on tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, and indium. Now, I may have pronounced some of those wrong, but they're rare earth metals and rare earth materials. Now, all these rare earth materials are used in a lot of high-tech and military applications. So, and the point with these is that China controls like a huge amount of these. In some, it's more than 90%, and it's not necessarily that other areas in the world and the US don't have deposits of these, but where China are really, really strong is in the processing of these. So, you know, you can get some of these out of the ground, but other countries just don't have the ability to process them. And I think that's something that can't be quickly done. So, you know, this is something that will really affect the USA. And I think of all the sanctions that China have imposed this time, the tariffs and sanctions, this one of the rare earth minerals and metals will be the one that will give America the most problems. Additionally to that, they've launched an antitrust investigation into Google, and they are talking about more investigations into Nvidia and Intel. Now, my suspicion with the Google one, so most phone manufacturers, mobile phone manufacturer in China, still use Google as their underlying operating system. Now, many of them modify it, but ultimately underlying their modifications are still Google's Android. Now, Huawei have actually developed Harmony OS, which is a completely new operating system built from the ground up, and they are very successful with that. From what I understand, it actually performs better than Android, because Android was developed many years ago, and they keep sort of adding to it and upgrading bits, whereas Harmony is very efficient because it's been built as a brand new OS from the ground up, and they released that I think the middle of last year. But I suspect this antitrust thing is to persuade more and more Chinese and mobile phone makers maybe to adopt Harmony OS. There's a big push in China now to get American hardware and software out of the tech scene in China, because basically China cannot trust the US anymore. You see with semiconductors and other things, they use these as a weapon, a geopolitical weapon, and China don't want to be held ransom to American technology. So it's very important, and there's a big drive for China to create their own technology ecosystem with all domestic hardware and software. So that's that. Additionally to that, they added a couple of companies to its China's unreliable entity list. I think no big deal about them. And they've also filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization, claiming these tariffs seriously violate WTO rules, which they do. But I think the problem is I think the WTO has kind of lost its authority. I believe there's one of the council members or something like that, I may be wrong on that, but the US have failed to appoint one, so the WTO can't operate. And even if they do operate, it's kind of like the US has become a law unto themselves, so they don't abide by any of the rulings the WTO issues anymore, which is, it's the way it is. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Trump has stated he's in no hurry to engage with Chinese President Xi Jinping to de-escalate tensions despite China's sanctions. Now, how I think this will affect the USA is that all goods are going to have an additional 10% tariff added to them that go into the USA. Now, this is bound to affect inflation because there's a huge amount of goods on American supermarket shelves that come from China. And although there'll be a number of companies that have probably anticipated this move, so they will have stocked up a little bit, it will eventually trickle through to the consumers, because Trump will try to tell American consumers that it's China who pays those tariffs, but it's actually not China who pays those tariffs. It's actually US companies who import those goods pay the tariffs. Now, they're probably not going to take a 10% loss, so they will pass some, if not all of that, onto the consumer, which will ultimately increase the cost of those goods. Now, I do see what Trump is trying to do. He's trying to bring manufacturing back to the US, but that's something that's a really long-term thing. China, from a point of view of manufacturing, nobody can get anywhere close. They've got manufacturing clusters. They've really, concentrated on manufacturing over the last 25, 30 years, and they're absolutely expert at it, and for any country to be able to compete with that is really tough. Now, as regards China, I actually think that China this time around, compared to the previous Trump administration, China are much more prepared for these tariffs. And over the last years, China have switched a lot of their trade to different regions of the world. So if you look at China's trade now with Southeast Asia, it's bigger than America and the EU put together. And the trade that China are doing with the US now is much less than they were, say, 8 or 10 years ago. So I think that China can easily cope with these additional tariffs from the US, and all China will do is continue to pivot more of their trade to Southeast Asia, and now with Indonesia joining the BRICS. You look at China's trade with Indonesia, it's actually skyrocketed over the last few years, and now Indonesia are part of BRICS. That will just continue to grow. So that's how I think it will affect China. Now, the funny one here is the European Union. It's very funny. Just yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen is now sort of realising that the EU, after being America's vassal for all this time, apart from a couple of states within the EU, Hungary being one of them, most of the others have been sort of loyal lapdogs to America. Well, Trump is really shaking things up. I think before long we're going to have some announcements of tariffs on Europe, and because they were a vassal of America, the EU somewhat burnt their bridges with China. It was America who derailed a few years ago. China and the EU were about to sort of sign a huge trade deal, and sort of America, Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden derailed that. So it leaves the EU a little bit out in the cold. So now Ursula von der Leyen is making noises about sort of rekindling the love with China, because they're starting to realise that they're going to be out on a limb if they don't. I think it was a very stupid move to abandon the trade deal with China in the first place. Anyway, that's my take on the tariffs. Let me know what you think in the comments. However, as always, for now, take care.